Ah, the Wild West. Dusty trails, endless plains, and bandits lurking behind every canyon. But not all outlaws were cut from the same rough cloth. Some outlaws preferred wit over weapons and poetry over pistols. Enter Black Bart, the Gentleman Bandit, a man who could rob you blind and leave you a poem as a keepsake. Yes, Black Bart wasn't your everyday desperado. He was a legend in his own peculiar way, a highwayman who didn't need to pull a trigger to make his point. Buckle up, folks, because we're diving into the life of the most polite outlaw to ever grace the West. Our story begins with a man of mystery, someone who seemed to appear out of thin air, Charles E. Boles, better known as Black Bart. Born in England in 1829, Charles moved to New York with his family as a young lad. Fast forward a few years, and the charming young Charles was drawn to the prospect of gold in California, just like countless others. But while others found fortune, Charles found frustration. When his dreams of striking gold panned out like a dry riverbed, Charles took an unexpected turn. After a series of life changes and perhaps a few too many misadventures, Charles transformed into Black Bart. And not just any Black Bart. This was the Black Bart who, while carrying a shotgun, famously never fired it, a gentlemanly thief in the most unlikely setting, the rugged terrain of the Sierra Nevadas. Now, you might think an outlaw like Bart would strike terror into the hearts of stagecoach drivers, right? Well, yes and no. Black Bart may have been a bandit, but he was also a bit of a character, a highwayman with style, grace, and most peculiarly, poetry. Dressed in a long duster coat and flour sack mask, Black Bart would hold up Wells Fargo stagecoaches with a tone as calm as a Sunday sermon. He didn't shout or threaten. He simply demanded their cash with a peculiar charm. And if you're wondering, how many robberies did he pull off? Well, that number is around 28. Yep, 28 successful heists without a single shot fired. Black Bart had a system, and it worked like a charm. One of Black Bart's most famous heists went down at a place called Funk Hill, near Copperopolis, California. Now, Funk Hill wasn't exactly prime real estate, but it had the perfect conditions for an ambush. A quiet, secluded trail surrounded by steep hills and thick brush. And Bart, being the meticulous planner he was, knew it like the back of his hand. On a crisp October day in 1878, Black Bart lay in wait for the Wells Fargo stagecoach he knew would be passing through, loaded with cash. When the coach came trundling up the hill, Bart stepped out from behind a rock, his signature flour sack mask covering his face and a rusty old shotgun in his hands. But true to form, he kept his distance. He didn't even aim the weapon at the stagecoach. Instead, he coolly shouted, "Please throw down the box!" The driver, visibly shaken, did just that. Bart walked over, cracked open the strongbox, and collected his loot without so much as a raised voice. But just as he was finishing up, a passenger decided to take matters into his own hands and fired a shot at Bart. And here's where things get interesting. Black Bart didn't return fire. Instead, he hightailed it down the hillside, disappearing into the trees with a quickness that belied his calm demeanor. But he didn't leave without a parting gift. When the stagecoach driver and passengers approached the spot where Bart had stood, they found his signature calling card, a short, cheeky poem scrawled on a slip of paper. This little note became one of Bart's most infamous trademarks, solidifying him not just as a bandit, but as a true character. The Funk Hill robbery was another feather in his cap, further confusing Wells Fargo and building his reputation as a gentleman thief who could pull off a heist and disappear without a trace, all while leaving behind a bit of flair. But here's where things get interesting. While most outlaws left empty wallets and bullet holes, Black Bart left poems. Yes, he had a penchant for poetry. On more than one occasion, Bart left behind little verses at the scene of his crimes. After his first known robbery in 1877, he left a poem that went something like this: "I've labored long and hard for bread, for honor and for riches, but on my corns too long you've tread, you fine-haired sons of guns." Alright, so Black Bart wasn't exactly Shakespeare. But who needs iambic pentameter when you're robbing stagecoaches? For Bart, poetry was part of his charm. Imagine being a Wells Fargo stagecoach driver, terrified out of your wits, only to find a cheeky poem left behind instead of bullet casings. It was odd, audacious, and utterly unforgettable. But what made Black Bart so unusual was that he never resorted to violence. His weapon of choice was intimidation, not bullets. Most of his victims never even saw his face, just that masked figure with a shotgun and a very polite manner. According to stories, Bart once told a driver not to worry, saying, "I'm not here to hurt you, I'm just after Wells Fargo's money." There's something strangely considerate about that, don't you think? And if anyone dared resist, Bart would simply put on his best, serious voice and suggest they reconsider. Black Bart's skills weren't limited to robbing stagecoaches. He was also a master of the disappearing act. One of his most memorable escapes happened at Tom Bell's Flats, a secluded spot near the Sierra Nevada foothills. It was a chilly morning, and Bart had just held up a Wells Fargo stagecoach with his usual polite, non-violent manner. But this time, something unusual happened. A posse was already hot on his trail. Unbeknownst to Bart, Wells Fargo had set up a trap, positioning several men along his usual escape routes. As Bart made his way down a winding path, he spotted movement in the distance, armed riders closing in from multiple directions. The Gentleman Bandit was outnumbered, and his escape options were quickly running out. But Bart wasn't about to give up his freedom so easily. In a stroke of genius, Bart doubled back, heading straight toward the posse. Now, this wasn't an act of desperation, it was a calculated move. You see, Bart had studied the landscape well, and he knew that a steep ravine lay hidden just a few yards away. Sprinting toward it, he made a daring leap, landing halfway down the ravine on a narrow ledge hidden from sight. As the posse thundered past, Bart crouched low, holding his breath. He waited there for nearly an hour, perfectly still, until the coast was clear. Then, with the agility of a mountain cat, he climbed back up, casually dusted himself off, and strolled away, leaving his pursuers baffled and empty-handed. The Tom Bell's Flats escape became one of Black Bart's most celebrated feats, proving once again that he was more than just a poet. He was a master strategist with an uncanny knack for staying one step ahead. Now, Wells Fargo wasn't thrilled with Black Bart's artistic robberies. In fact, they were losing a lot of money, and the poetry didn't exactly ease their frustrations. They hired top detectives, and for years, Black Bart managed to stay one step ahead. But it wasn't luck. It was meticulous planning. Bart would choose secluded, mountainous areas where he could make a quick getaway, and he never hit the same location twice in a row. Now you're probably wondering, how did it all come crashing down? Every good run has to end sometime, right? Well, Bart's unraveling came about because of a little item he left behind, a handkerchief. Yes, in a twist of irony, the poet Outlaw was undone by a piece of cloth. During his final robbery in 1883, Bart left behind a handkerchief with a laundry mark, FX07. The detectives traced it to a laundromat in San Francisco, which ultimately led them to a man named Charles E. Boles. After years of baffling detectives and frustrating Wells Fargo, the Gentleman Bandit was finally in their grasp. And you can bet Wells Fargo detectives were thrilled to finally get their hands on him. When the detectives arrived to arrest him, Charles E. Boles didn't put up a fight. There was no dramatic showdown, no defiant standoff. Instead, they found a mild-mannered man who looked more like an accountant than an outlaw. And to everyone's surprise, Black Bart admitted to his crimes with a touch of pride. He confessed to his robberies but was quick to note he'd never hurt anyone. During the trial, Bart's reputation as a gentleman preceded him. The court and the public were both intrigued by this strange breed of outlaw, polite, witty, and completely unarmed. For his crimes, he was sentenced to 6 years in San Quentin. Bart served only 4 years though, and after his release, he disappeared just as mysteriously as he had arrived. After his release, Black Bart gave an interview to a newspaper where he claimed he was done with his life of crime. "I'm through with crime," he said. "It's been too good to me." And that was that. Bart slipped into obscurity, leaving only whispers and rumors in his wake. So here's to Black Bart, the poet bandit of the Sierra Nevadas. May his verses echo in the canyons and his legend live on as one of the West's most peculiar and endearing outlaws.